It's good to be talking with you about Ian McGilchrist again. It's been a while.
It has.
We've been digesting his book for a long time, an excellent book, The Master and His Emissary.
It's a fantastic book.
And we talked a lot about part one, and now we're ready to dive into part two of the book, which is with the extension. So part one dealt with left and right brain differences in individuals, and part two is trying to apply the concepts of lateralization to kind of the arc of literature and society and culture. Yeah.
I mean, just before we say anything about it, it's a really audacious undertaking. You know. I mean, he's talking about more or less everything.
Yes, absolutely.
And the mechanism through which we process everything and produce our everything version of everything. I mean, no wonder it took him 30 years.
It's massive, and it's. I think you and I have both said at different times it's one of the best things we've ever read.
No, it is.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. I love the book, but what I have some issues with the second part. Like in the first part of this book, I had nothing. I was just everything was well researched, put together. I basically was along for the ride and learned so much. From what he presented.
I'm going to go back to it again and again, Yeah,
in the second part of the book, I have some issues with where he goes, where he pivots to. Not issues, but I'm not sure that I buy in as much as I bought into everything that was in the first half of the book. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And then, and the other thing that I have to say is that this is a guy who, he got his PhD in literature first. And he was so fascinated by the psychology of that's built into the literature that he went and got a PhD in psychology. So any misgivings I have are from my understanding of literature, but I'm not studied it like this guy has.
Oh yeah.
So even I might be on the fence between wondering if he's just trying to apply something that he sees because it makes for a good story, or if he just understands it better than I do.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of different times where I did feel like, does this, are you seeing this in this way to fit an argument that you've already made?
Right.
So, but, I mean,
same thing.
In the first part, so much of it is medically and anatomically based that it's just like, even with having studied medicine, and myself, like that. As a psychiatric nurse practitioner, it's still like an enormous amount of highly refined information that, so a lot of it is like, it's very hard to be objective about, in the sense, or I don't know if objective is the right word. It's very hard to not just passively go, okay, But then when he starts applying it to culture, it's like, I know more about this and than what you're talking about before. So,
that's exactly the feeling that I had.
Yeah.
And for me, it started like right at the beginning of section 2. He starts by and he makes a disclaimer about what I'm about to say, but it starts by extrapolating what he's learned about an individual into a culture. He recognizes that maybe it can't be done. Maybe the culture is bigger than the individual, but he does assert that you can talk about the left-brainedness or right-brainedness of a culture and how it shifts. But I'm not so sure. In my mind, the culture consists of a group of individuals that are on a spectrum in relationship to these things and how they see the world, whether it's left brain, right brain. You can look at modern society, human societies, and recognize that there is this left brain tendency. There is this science bent. There is this this mathematical bent to where we are today. But I just don't think I don't think you can necessarily say that means that's caused by a shift in the culture completely.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't either. I mean, a lot of, I don't know, when you start talking on this kind of very large scale, overarching kind of view of culture itself, it becomes very soft on the edges. Any kind of argument you come up with, porous or whatever, it has very porous borders. So
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, man. It's really hard to even try to make very definitive statements about it. I'm gonna take it. Hold on a second.
Get the cough out. Yeah.
Much better. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing like when you with literature or with any type of art form that is making some type of cultural statement. I know I always bring up Kubrick, but whatever. Like Dr. Strangelove, that's making satire out of nuclear annihilation, and
Right.
but also poking extreme fun at the strategic wing command or whatever it was called back then, right? And just the army, it's the military itself. You can do that in a way that's very robustly subtextual and implicatory. Like everything means something else. What he's doing is trying to make direct correlations, right? And say this is this, and this is arising from whatever hemispheric orientation is kind of taking the helm. So I don't know.
That's a great example. So if you think about just that specific movie, is it a right-brained exercise or a left-brained exercise? You'd have to say it's art. It's coming from the right brain at a time exactly when the argument that McGilchrist is making is that the entire culture is moving to the left,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right, in an extreme way. And so it's a perfect example, and I'm sure there are hundreds of other things that are happening. There's this interplay, like there is in an individual between the left and right hemisphere, between what people are doing and what they're reacting to.
Even in the nature of what that film is. I mean, it's basically like a right brain representation of making fun of the very strategic and regimented left brain.
Yeah, it is. Right, it's seeing it both. And yeah. So that's one of my things with it is, and again, to be fair to the guy, Gilchrist recognizes this at the outset, and he says it's a stretch, but I'm going to do it anyway because I feel like I want to explore it. So it's great. Definitely worth doing. I'm just not so sure I'm on board.
Yeah.
And it makes me think back to another concept that you and I have talked about, but not really explored. It was from the Erich Neumann book, The Origin and History of Consciousness, where he talked about the great man theory or something like that. So there's an idea in there that you have a culture, you have a society, but you have individuals that are a little bit more evolved or advanced or somehow more tapped into the subconscious. And those people become the guideposts for leading into the next wave of the evolution of an entire culture. I don't think Neumann explored it enough in that book, and I'm really interested in it because of the fact that we have these historical figures that are doing this very thing and seem to be moving us in these directions. But that's just one example. If you've got this, you've got a great man, he's on the spectrum somewhere. You've got society, which is all over the board. But I just feel like there's that potential for an individual or a small group to kind of lead the way forward, rather than things just being a symptom of this pendulum swing, right to left and back again.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's a great, because these people function as kind of like a signpost to a new space, and it's kind of like the Nietzschean Übermensch thing to some degree. But just in a kind of more pixelated way or something. Like it isn't just this one person. That it's people who at different times satisfy that function. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's and I don't. The other thing is, I'm not really good at remembering all of the movements in literature, but when he's attaching the right brain, left brain tag, he's talking about things like the Renaissance, things
exactly
like Romanticism, and I couldn't put them all in order right now, but I mean, he
Right.
does a really good job of going through and documenting where he thinks the culture was left brain and where it swung to the right and back again.
Back, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specifically. I found it really compelling. I don't recall it
Yeah.
that
Well,
well right now.
I mean, I recall it to some degree, but I just generally speaking, it seemed like, the move toward like romanticism, like you were saying, like if you were to compare like Claude Debussy and Arnold Schoenberg, right? Like Claude Debussy would be very right brain, very Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun and type music with it. Very impressionistic and very broad strokes and very kind of soft edges. And then you have Arnold Schoenberg, who's I am creating my new system, and he's just gonna have this system that's gonna revolutionize everything. And then everybody after that had to have their own system, and so you have serial music and all that after that becomes where absolutely everything is structured. Now, while in Debussy everything is structured, it's done so in a way that's very lush and a lot of emotion.
You would be able to think through the musical aspect of it. I think he talks a lot about literature, poetry, even prose, but he does talk about the music.
A little, yeah.
You're very well educated on all of that.
Not so much the literature.
Right, and me either. But for example, I know that you love Bach, and I think that he talks about Bach a lot. And I think he's going to position Bach as somebody that's right in one of these in between transitions where he's got both the left and the right brain.
That's perfect with Bach.
Yeah,
It really is. I mean, the B minor Mass, and there are points in it that are just so ecstatic and so incredibly complicated, and so well constructed at the same time that it's just it's mind-boggling. It's like braingasm music or eargasm or something. I don't know. The stuff is incredible.
yeah. And it's probably because it's deeply participating in both sides, left and right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And that might be why Bach has resonated down the ages so profoundly, because you really get hooked emotionally and you feel stuff in it. But at the same time, you look at from the musical offering, the Sixth Voice Fugue, and think, how the fuck did you write that? Come on, you're a madman.
Yeah. And that's hundreds of years later, you're still thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's fortunately documented.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of a different point I wanted to make, which is about where McGilchrist starts. So he has to have a starting point. If he's going to talk about how left brain and right brain dominates or is subservient during different times, he's got to start somewhere. And he starts in the beginning of the Western tradition. He starts in classical Greece. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think you should start in classical Greece. I think it's a little bit arbitrary to do so. Mm-hmm. Because you have to remember that for a couple of thousand years before that, civilizations were thriving. We just don't have a great record of them. We just don't really know what was happening, and that's probably the reason you don't try to delve into that. Mm-hmm. There's good reasons, I'm sure he doesn't try to delve into Egypt, but for God's sakes, I mean, that was for like 3,000 years before classical Athens, was a thriving society, which surely had its own tendencies left and right.
Oh yeah.
But so that's the backdrop. But the thing about that you were just saying about Bach that I thought McGilchrist said, which is familiar to that idea, is that classical Athens was not just a lateralization. It wasn't a culture moving from left to right or vice versa. What he actually thinks is it was the whole brain growing. It was the prefrontal cortex, right? Whatever the activity is, was actually growing at the same time. So he almost positions it as like this egg from which things are going to be spawned.
Right. Yeah.
And if you just in the way that you were just talking about Bach, it's kind of the same thing, right? It's like you've got this one example that can inspire you through the ages wherever you are. I think a lot of Western civilization looks back at classical Athens in the same way.
Yeah.
It's like this thing that sort of had command of both left and right, but was just getting bigger, and then went on to kind of swing left and right and left again.
Right. Yeah. Well, which is, I mean, it's really interesting when you think of this stuff too, just politically, like just even now with Biden and just everything that's going on, things being on one end of the spectrum, and then swinging so hard back and forth, and people refer to it as left and right, and I don't know, maybe there's a reason.
It is funny. I mean, it's not the same thing that McGilchrist is talking about,
right,
but it is this dichotomy that sort of satisfies us, right? We kind of, it helps people to think of things in these classes and to compare them and see what the extremes are.
The poles, yeah.
Which is kind of what left brain, right brain is. It's just funny that it's the same language. It's the left, the political left and the political right.
It really is. But I mean, with the stuff in Neumann about ancient Egypt, there is obviously plenty of information about that culture in that time. So yeah, maybe I think you're right. It is kind of arbitrary to base it.
But it's just not. We just don't have enough of it to be as nuanced as he is. I mean, when he talks about Wordsworth, like the guy is on a whole other level. He's like he knows all of it so cold in a way that we just don't have even this kind of information from ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yeah. But to me, there's just no doubt that those thriving civilizations were on a parallel with what we think of as the cradle of Western civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, Neumann, I don't know, Lacey, I mean, it just seems like all podcasts lead to Neumann. All roads lead to Neumann.
Yeah. And can I tell you where I think he got it wrong specifically,
please,
Neumann? Yes. There's a part in that book where he says Minoan Greece, so this is Bronze Age Greece, Minoan Greece represented the phase of humans just becoming human. So basically he's saying there was a maternal fertility goddess, there was a cult around that goddess. This was at a time when people had not evolved into what they had become in other places like Egypt and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. I just think it's bullshit. I think you cannot possibly say, okay, it's in a space of 600 years, human consciousness evolves to that extent. Right. I think you've got to be talking about thousands and thousands of years. I buy the argument, but I just can't. When he pinpoints Minoan Greece as like, I'm like, no, people in Minoan Greece were exactly like people in classical Athens. Yeah. Like it wasn't like they thought that much differently. I just don't believe it,
Yeah. I think you're right. I think a lot of times, especially when you're looking back at history, sometimes you just have to make like okay, it was here. Like this, it has to be somewhere. I'm going to claim it here. And if you make it thousands and thousands of years, it becomes something that's beyond like people's natural inclination to think of things as having like boundaries. It just becomes this mushy thing in history.
It does.
So sometimes I think people end up just saying, fuck it. I'm editing here.
Draw the line. We've got, and we'll move on. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be totally off topic here. But I was reading about kind of the ancient Middle East. And so there are these human civilizations that date back to like 9,000 BC.
Yeah.
And they're like these collections of huts. They're just room. They're kind of stacked. They're very simple. And there's so much evidence that what happened is the people that lived in these huts died. When they died, they were buried in the floor of these huts. And they built on top and on top and on top.
Whoa.
But this whole but in what I was reading, basically, if you just really try to put yourself in the position these people were in, I would say they thought differently than I do. Right? They were more animal than I am. They were more, tied into not understanding life and death and trying to. I mean, they're reckoning with it. They're trying to do something about it, but they're not organizing and planning a city. They're just basically glommed together because of the agriculture or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's only 9,000 years ago. So I do get to a place where I think I could start to draw a line. I just don't think it's like 1200 BC. I think it's way further back than that.
I do too. And I mean, there's all kinds of settlements to go back really, really far. There's that one in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe or something like that. Yeah, that was like buried for millennia or something. And but I mean, I forget how far back that dates, but it's ludicrous. It's
in the same ballpark. It's in these like thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
And that also seems to be where a lot of this civilization was happening. Anyway,
and I think you're probably right. It probably had to do with just the availability, like, of animals and food of whatever sort and water. That would be the thing. So
and this establishment of community, something larger than hunter gatherer, something larger than a band of 30 or 50 people that are that can live in a place long enough to have ancestor worship, that can start to try to reckon with this stuff rather than just moving and dying.
Yeah, and death being something where you simply leave somebody behind. You don't have them hanging out in the freaking floor.
and probably digging them up periodically. That's another thing that they said. I'm like, wow, okay.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, can you still smell dad?
I can kind of imagine it.
Yeah.
Like, right? Like that's me trying to get into that mindset. I can kind of see like this is what we do. We live, we grow old, we get wrinkly, we die, we bury them under the floor. and then the next up. Yeah. I can kind of see that.
Man, what was the Poe thing, the Telltale Heart?
Where he buries.
These people had way more disturbing thoughts than Poe.
Dark and grisly.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was a total sidetrack. So
that's all right. Yeah.
I don't know. So what else did I want to say? Anything you want to add here?
No, not really. I mean, that's.
Here's something that I was thinking of too. So McGilchrist spends a lot of time talking about Homer, and one of the things he asserts and argues is that in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's very little attention paid to the description of faces. So Homer's famously descriptive, but there is this like sort of blank space when it comes to a face. He doesn't describe eyes, he doesn't describe countenances, and McGilchrist thinks this is because of the way that the brain is leaning, right? A left brain breaks everything down into bits. A right brain understands the whole thing. So he talks about how that's evidence that you have this left brain tendency underpinning Homer. And I just don't think that's true either.
Yeah.
I am thinking that in these epics, in Homer, I think this was the fundamental entertainment of Dark Age Greece.
Right.
Like you had these rhapsodes going around, people that were really good at telling the story. You didn't have anything else to do. I think it was rhythmic, it was song, it was storytelling. right? Which you can see. I mean, that's what we all thrive on. I have this idea that the lack of description of faces has to do with leaving something open to the interpretation of the audience.
Yes.
So
I
if
was
your
thinking the same
only
thing.
sort of your only sort of entertainment is this story, and you already know the story, but you're hearing somebody tell it in a fresh way, and maybe he's better at it than anybody you've ever heard. I think it would be important to have like the individual have the ability to fill in details, especially for the important things like that.
Oh yeah, and for their as an emotional hook in a sense, because they're gonna project onto that blankness things from their own lives, which is then going to make them that much more invested in the story.
Yeah, I totally think that's what that is.
Yeah.
So again, I think I've got a bunch of I'm nitpicking with McGilchrist. I still love the second half of the book, but there
me
are just
too,
certain things where I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't think that's what it is. And he describes a study of faces in art for over across hundreds of years, and he talks about the orientation moving from right to left and back again, which that I found really compelling.
It's
like
really
you see
compelling.
themes like that, and you say, okay, that maybe there is something at work in the subconscious mind of the artist that's tapping into where the artist is in the society, in the culture,
and the cultural continuum or whatever.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think you go all the way back to Homer, and I'm sure people had Homer anyway, and people who artists of whatever sort, right, would to some extent obey the H.P. Lovecraft dictum, and all things mysterious never explain. There's a reason for that.
That's great. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah. I mean, especially in stuff like horror, because that's why a lot of times in horror movies, when it's just one jump scare after the next, and then you just see lots of blood and guts and whatever, it's just so boring to me. I mean, I literally get tired,
Yeah.
and because it's just not engaging. What's engaging is having things only, partially explained, if just for a matter of like defining the context. And then if what's happening is more in the mind of the viewer, then it's going to be so much more terrifying. That's going to be because it's going to be you're styling it to yourself for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. You're scaring the shit out of yourself.
Right. With imagery
with some help
you can
from
barely control. Yeah.
And that's probably what separates great horror movies from other horror movies, right? Is this leaving that space open to the darkness of the viewer's mind. Yeah.
Right. And that's why The Shining has lasted so well. It's just nothing but that, I mean, there's some, really there's just two deaths in the movie. One is gory and one is just frozen, but the
it's
gory...
the isolation. It's the space, right? It's so much space to be alone.
Yeah. And so much is left to audience interpretation. Well, the whole time Kubrick's fucking with you. So, I don't know. It's just much more engaging.
It is, and jarring, and like,
and terrifying. And like, if not, I guess I don't think of The Shining as being a scary movie as much as like a psychologically terrifying movie.
Yeah. Which is where I always go when I'm filtering for something to watch. I'm always like psychological thriller. That's what I want. Something well done. There are a lot of bad ones, but
my phone's getting a little bit low, so if it dies, I'll just call you back.
Okay. Let's see what else. I don't want to belabor the Homer point, but I do. I've got this idea that like if an alien were to observe our society in the 21st century, and they were to look at our entertainment, they'd look at movies, right?
Yeah.
That's cinema is what they would look at. And I can imagine somebody forming the idea that humans in the 21st century had to think of things episodically.
Right.
Like that's how they viewed the world in these neat little episodes that led one to the other. And they also had to have tension build as those things happened.
Yeah.
like
keep things.
this is what I mean about like you can overread into how people actually think because you're looking at the media, the thing that entertains them, and of course it's set up like that because it is storytelling. But it doesn't mean that like human beings have to have this like beginning episode
Right.
tension, you know,
Right.
all that. But,
Although high school did feel like that. It's like, and now a new season.
a new year, yeah, that's right. I guess on the flip side, you might be able to argue that we do think like that.
I think to a degree.
I
for a
kind of
while.
poo-pooed the idea as I was thinking about it, but as I just said it, I'm wondering maybe that is how
I think we
the
start
story that
off
we tell
way.
ourselves.
We start off
Yeah.
that way, you know, the whole programmatic getting through school stuff, and you know,
Yeah.
everything coming in specific stages, and so you know you leave sixth grade and you were the big sixth grader, and now you're the shrimpy seventh grader, and, yeah, and then the same thing happens again in high school, and the same thing happens again in college.
Yeah,
And then, you know, you get out into the world and things open up a bit, but
yeah,
yeah, I mean, you know, I over the course of the 12 years of school, I went to 10 different schools. So
wow,
yeah, so I went to 5 pre-high schools and then 5 high schools. So it I couldn't help but notice patterns, you know, like all the punk kids in every place I was ever at were, you know, rabid about being rugged individualists and listening to punk, but they all dressed exactly alike and listened to the same music, and it's just like, this is dumb. But it was the same in California and Indiana, you know, in the Midwest on the East Coast.
Oh, that's a
Yeah.
very unique perspective. Yes,
and
because
that's
when you're
just
that
one
age,
example. Mhm.
yeah, you just assume that what you're living in is what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, to be able to see it from all those different places.
Yeah. But what I mean is its own like cultural thing, I guess. But well, anyway, back to McGilchrist. Total
McGilchrist,
Another
yeah.
another tangent.
Just looking over what I got here. So he talks a lot about the evolution of writing and language, which I think the chapters he devotes to that are super interesting, just because that's something that I've studied a lot of.
Yeah.
And one of the things that McGilchrist asserts is that when we see writing being formalized, that is evidence and a signal that the culture is moving in a left brain direction. Right? It's making sense of the little footnotes and the little pecking that we did into clay tablets, and it's making it more formalized and organized. And he talks specifically about the introduction of vowels. So early written language is nothing but consonants just to get the idea across. Once you start adding vowels into it, you're starting to be more thoughtful about formalizing the communication, which he takes to be a move into the left brain space for the culture.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And it probably is, but I'm thinking there's also another reason for that to happen, which is writing things down became very powerful for taking action across long distances, right?
And
so if
time.
you've got a ruler and time, right? If you've got a ruler in one place in Turkey who has an empire that's growing, he's got to be able to communicate with the outskirts of that empire more quickly and effectively. So, and maybe that is what being left brain is all about. Maybe empire is part of that, or maybe that's just how it works. Once you figure out that you can write down and mimic what the voice is doing, maybe it just becomes more formalized because you suddenly have more control at a distance. So I don't know if it's one or the other thing. He's very big on the fact that at this point, as the alphabets are growing, that it is this shift to the left brain of that culture.
He also talked about the actual structure of stuff on the page, and one thing I didn't know, you know, as a process of formalization. One thing I didn't know is did you know this in ancient Greek for a while in being written down didn't just go like left to right or whatever. It would go and then come back.
Yeah,
right?
They'd go this way, and then they go that way, and they go that way. Yes, I've seen those texts.
Wow. I had no idea. I'd never known that. That just blows my mind.
And at that time, nothing but consonants. So you basically have to say them out loud and infer what the vowels are, and you have to do that. You have to guess where you're going next, and that's the whole thing. That's informalized. That's the writing starting to become something that's systematic,
Right.
That
But
is generally understood.
right, but it's still like it's literally snaking around on the page. You know, like
And there's
that's. I mean, it's so interesting to think of the process of formalization allowing for a time period of this incredibly loose in a way, but at the same time, when in that time having no vowels and having to snake back and forth across the page. I think he called it like ox, like an ox plowing the field or something.
yeah, that's the word for it is something like that. Yeah.
That but I mean you'd have to really pay attention, and or you're just going to get lost, and you have to say it out loud as well. So it's
You do.
so I would think it forces you to read better, you know.
Yeah,
So it's
but it's a
interesting.
pain in the ass also.
Oh yeah, right.
So there's only a small group of people that can probably do it, or that even want to do it.
Right.
You know.
They have
Oh,
the
there's this
patience.
famous thing. I think it was Plato, a famous Greek philosopher. I think it was Plato, talked about how bad writing was, because what it did is it abstracted the thought, it put it down on paper, and therefore it just stripped it of its actual fundamental meaning. Which is exactly left and right brain, right? That's the thing that you're arguing against, is if once you write it down and once you can just regurgitate it, you're not thinking it.
Right. Yeah.
It's taken out of your right hemisphere, and now it's just okay. Now you know a fact.
See, that's really another way of thinking of this is so in what's it called, Full Metal Jacket Diary, Matthew Modine talks about how Kubrick would want people. One of the reasons he'd do so many takes wasn't because he was being a dick about it. It was because actors didn't have their lines down well enough, and he would ask people to get to the point where they don't have to think at all about their lines, so then they can inhabit the emotion.
Right.
So it becomes this. I mean, even Charlie Parker talked about how you should practice to the point that you practice very formally and very structured and very rigidly, and then when you play, let it all go and just go, and then you're tapping into something else.
That is it. That's exactly the thing. So you might gripe that if you write it down, you're bastardizing what it originally was, but then again, this is the only way we have to commune with Socrates,
Right.
is if we can go back through it over and over again to the point that we feel like we understand it. Now we've rebuilt it into the right hemisphere.
Right.
It's
You
that,
embodied it. Yeah.
Same with music. Same.
Yep.
like I think that's the Charlie Parker point.
Yeah, I do too.
So I wrote this really long note, and it was a voice memo, so there's a lot of typos. And since you're probably going to edit this anyway, let me read it to you, and then maybe we can talk about if it resonates in any way. Okay, so I'm just gonna try to read it, and I'll try to fill in the little typos that are in here. So, okay, I think I have one original insight at this point in the book. This is near the end. Although McGilchrist has made the point several times, he makes it again here. He's saying that the left hemisphere prefers straight lines and the right hemisphere prefers curved lines. And so when we see the urbanization, man-made creations, straight lines across our horizons, we associate this contrast and shapes to be evidence that the left hemisphere is the one designing and building. And I think this is true. However, my own insight into this is that these straight lines versus curved natural environments go back a long, long way. They predate classical Athens. They go back to Mycenaean times. And then the masonry and times language was used to record stores of harvested crops. And agriculture had presumably turned from an art, a right brain, into a science, left brain. All of this would suggest that there was a time prior to classical Athens and even the pre-classical period of which McGilchrist speaks, in which the left hemisphere was in fact dominant, snatching science from magic, creating straight lines against the curves of nature. And of course, it's not even just about Athens. The street line shapes predates the Greek cultures by quite a bit, especially in Egypt. Temples, pyramids. What is a temple, if not a monument celebrating the straight line unification against the rolling sands of Egypt? And so I think that this line of thought might be a way for me to clarify my thinking around the beginning of part 2 of this book. Namely, I still continue to struggle to believe that cultures are defined by hemisphere tendencies to the degree that McGilchrist suggests. And so if I am right, it would seem rather arbitrary to select 6th century Greece as a place where lateralization really started to show up in culture in the West.
That's
so that was a really long note, but that's this idea of cities and straight lines. It goes to temples and pyramids and right and taking agriculture on and making it a scientific pursuit. The lines of your seeds and your crops and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and just I lived for the majority of my life in Chicago, right? And Chicago is just one gigantor grid. It really is. It's just a freaking grid. Boop, 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 boop.
Yep.
And I remember going to Brussels and walking around and thinking, where the hell am I? I could not figure anything out. I went to the Delirium Cafe and had Trappist ale, which was a huge mistake to do at noon. I had no idea. But I leave and I'm so blitzed that I remember walking around trying to find my hotel, and the cafe's right by that famous statue of the boy pissing.
Oh yeah.
And so here's it kind of facing this way, okay? And I come from the Delirium Cafe, see it, and turn right, and then I'm lost. I'm trying to find my hotel, and then the next thing I know, I'm seeing that freaking statue from behind as I approach it this way. I made this total circle, oh God, but that was Middle Ages urban planning.
Yeah. Right?
No planning. And so I can see, I don't know if I believe that's necessarily more right-brained, Right. It might just be there's a lot. This is where it gets really, really difficult to think about, is when you think about not just the brain orientation, but the actual structural orientation of how a society relates to itself. How the individuals within it relate to each other.
Yes.
And so if you have a mostly illiterate populace who do physical labor as a means of surviving and existing within an economy, you're going to have people who will have a different set of skills than people who are highly educated and work at computers all day or something.
Yeah. Totally. I think that's kind of what I was trying to say at the beginning. Is you've got this? It's a whole stratification of points of view and ways of looking at things. It's not a single thing, and it all goes into the makeup of what a culture is, as opposed to what a human is. What a person is probably the genetic imprint is probably dominant enough that's just who that person is. So when you take this cast of characters, it's hard, although not impossible, to talk about the culture that they all make up as having an attitude.
Yep.
Like, I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying it's hard for me to wrap my head around.
It's very hard because it becomes like enmeshed in almost like emotional statistics or something, where
Yeah.
you're talking about the emotional statistics of an entire populace.
Yeah.
Like, my God, that gets complicated fast.
Which is constantly changing. Not even being born and dying, but people just changing their minds.
Yeah.
Individuals just like looking at things a different way all of a sudden.
Yeah, yeah. You
That
can read, you can find yourself reading a book in 1990 called American Psycho, and in it, the psycho is in love with Donald Trump, and Trump is brought up 40 some times in the book, and just Trump, 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 and he just can't wait. Oh, Trump is just the best, and then
Wow.
wait long enough, and then motherfucker's president.
That's right. And then you have a whole different way that you react to the art.
Yeah, and you're at a different stage in your life,
Yes.
and
And a lot has happened. Yeah.
and who knows what has happened to you. Like, here's a really small scale example of something, but this is so ridiculous in a way, but I think it kind of illustrates to the point. I found a mouse, okay.
Oh yeah. Herman, right? Yeah.
Right, in our driveway. And poor little Herman was just, I think he'd been dropped by a bird or something. He was just freaking out and shaking and obviously in shock. He didn't even move when I picked him up. And I made a little habitat, we called it the Hermitat, for Herman. And Karen named him Herman. And it was obvious that Herman had not gone through his ordeal unscathed. Right? I could tell something was a little askew with Herman.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was askew was that Herman would only turn to the left.
Oh really?
Yeah. And he would do it a lot, right? And like, if you picked up his little rock, he would just go around to the left. And if he walked, he would just move to the left. So I think Herman may have had a little bit of Herman brain damage from his experience. So now, for Herman, I mean, this is something McGilchrist talks about, right? The people who only see the left half of the plate and everything. But for Herman now, the world is very much biased to the left.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, what does that do to his entire process of existing and the way he processes information and functions in his little mouse land?
I'm always trying. I want to try to imagine what it's like to be Herman. I do. I just want to try to which is almost impossible because it's a fucking mouse, right? Like, how can you? But you can just imagine, just imagine a bird picking you up with a huge talon, like a monstrous bird picking you up and somehow coming at you from your right side. And then you get dropped and you're in a habitat. Maybe you're going to be avoiding the right side. Maybe it just totally changes your outlook.
Oh yeah.
The way that you think.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's it's like David Bowman at the end of 2001 in the human habitat that is the hotel room that's got the glowing floor and everything, and he goes through different stages. He's like become unstuck in time, like that Kurt Vonnegut character, Billy Pilgrim, I think.
Billy Pilgrim,
yeah. So that was Slaughterhouse 45, right?
Slaughterhouse 5, yeah.
Slaughterhouse 5, 45. I don't know where I got the 4. But I can't. Right. I think about that stuff too, especially with animals. If you try to put yourself in the mindset of a deer or something, and there are these things that they're very bright at night that go very fast, and they fly right past you, and if you don't time it right, they'll kill you.
Right.
I mean,
you've seen them kill somebody.
Right.
Else.
Right. Yeah. We know them to be cars.
Right.
The deer knows it to be bright, fast death.
Yeah. Good luck.
Bright, fast death gamble.
Yeah, I think I do. I'm fascinated by it. I'm always trying to put myself in that position.
Yeah.
Don't know why.
I do the same thing.
Yeah.
But, so, I mean, the whole idea when I brought up Brussels and everything, just how does an entire culture the way it moves is almost unfathomable, you know. So I mean, it's so incredibly difficult to try to have any kind of what's interesting is it's very difficult to have a specifically left-brained orientation rendering of, or whatever, understanding of.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what McGilchrist is trying to do.
It is.
Yeah.
It is what. Yeah, of course, because you're trying to describe this thing, and that's a left brain activity.
And
he would recognize that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he does go as far as saying at the end of this, and this is, I guess, if I do have a gripe with it, with the second part of the Master and his Emissary, it's this. At the end of the second part, McGilchrist is basically wondering whether or not human culture is getting to a break, is moving so far left, so fast, that it's going to break the cycle. And he did such a magnificent job of setting up the interplay between right and left and how it always has to return. It's like information's in, it's processed, you know, it's decoded, it's fed, the results are fed back in, it's this loop. And that really was hammered home in the first part, to the extent that I cannot imagine that there's a way for a break to even happen. So if we see that we're on a point of break, we probably should think that we're on a point of returning to something a little more right-brained.
Well, yeah, I would. I wonder if you could even make some type of argument based on the idea that if it goes too far, it becomes the other. You know,
it becomes the other. Yes, yeah.
Just kind of like the political idea, you know, like the horseshoe thing, right? I mean, like it seems like if you have, you know, I'm going to do this from the point of view of the camera just to make it more interesting. if you have, you know, people moving consistently to the left, right, politically, or people are moving consistently more to the right, at some point they become very similar. And I think the point they become very similar is they both become authoritarian, you know?
Okay, yeah.
And then they become the same thing, you know, and they kind of merge into each other. Maybe the brain does the same thing. In which case, the political idea could be a cultural manifestation of the way the brain functions.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example, and that's what I would think too. Is that there's this organic plasticity.
Yeah.
There's not. It just seems to me that there's not a chance that one side of this breaks out and just does all this damage, and it just rips apart humanity. I can't see that happening. If it hasn't happened in the past. Humanity's been around for a goddamn long time. Like, right. I can't see our circumstance being so special that this is the moment it's happening.
I think you could make arguments for certain cultures becoming that thing, like the Nazis or something,
right?
You know, or just whatever, you know, just, you know, specifically authoritarian one way or the other, and then, you know, they're like we were saying before. There's then examples of observing these trends and satirizing them, like Dr. Strangelove, you know.
Yeah.
And so there just seems to be a very, I don't know how to say this, an extremely varied set of fail-safe options built into the brain, you know. And I think that, and then built into the culture. Since, I mean, that's basically what he's saying, is that, you know, the two sides of the brain bring about a specific cultural resonance that has, you know, this cultural impact. So if the brain has these fail safes, then the culture would too, I would think.
Yeah.
Right?
I think so. I guess that's what I'm saying is I bought his argument so hard in the first part, and if we want to extrapolate this to culture, then I think I have to build that into that. Like these fail-safes, like you say, they got to be there. And I think we see them. We see these swings, and they happen quickly, and they're just shifts.
And, you know, what I honestly believe, I think I honestly believe this, but I'm kind of working on the fly here. But one of the biggest fail-safe things that repairs, let's say, specific runs one direction or the other, right, left or right, in any way, is humor. you know, in the individual, in the culture as well. You know, the moment we are incapable of being okay with making fun of each other is the moment we become true enemies in a way. You know, like so.
And even at that moment, the humor never goes away.
Yeah.
Even at that moment where there are certain things that are just taboo to joke about.
Right.
Guess what? People still joke about them. Like it doesn't go away. Like it just shifts.
It becomes funnier.
Yeah. That's a great example. Right, because humor is so much of humor is rooted in what's unexpected. What's the opposite of what you're thinking? What's the other side? The left to your right to your left. Yeah. That's really good.
And making fun of boundaries, you know, like Lenny Bruce on stage, you know, getting arrested by having this 50-foot microphone cable and walking out into the street and just saying, "Fuck," and getting arrested for indecency.
I know. Isn't that amazing? What is that? That's 50 years ago? 50 years ago. It's only 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah,
like, how innocuous does it seem right now?
Oh, yeah. It's so ludicrous.
It's not that long.
No. But then, you know, you have, you know, people put up, you know, whatever their ideas are on the efficacy of vaccines on YouTube, and YouTube will take down their video.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, all they're doing is walking into the street and going, "Fuck."
It's true. Oh, that reminded me. I was going to say something related to COVID. Oh, yeah. I think we're just talking about shifts from left to right, swings from left to right and back again, and how it's self-correcting. One of the things I hear in a lot of discussions about the virus and the vaccine is, I believe in science. And if you think about that for a second, you're talking about belief. Right. You're talking about science, right? And there's nothing more left and right brain about putting those things together. Yeah. That's, you know, we're all reacting how we're reacting, but I believe in science shouldn't get you out of a conversation. That should be like, okay, I believe in God. Okay, good. That's what we believe in. Like, are we having a conversation about beliefs or about facts or about what we think are fact? Like, just, it's this, you kind of see this reaction. You see it migrating and moving just over the last several months, right? Last year.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a funny phrase, you know. You know, I worship at the altar of science.
Right. Okay. Right.
Right.
It's the. I don't know if you've ever known any hardcore atheists. I have, and it's and it becomes sort of a person that I know would gather periodically, weekly, every other week with other people that didn't believe in God, and like sort of celebrate this idea that God doesn't exist. And it's like I understand that's the thought process, but you can substitute God doesn't exist for God does exist. It's the same goddamn thing.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it's just you're just rallying. You're inspired culturally by an idea.
You know, I can see, like, you know, the super believers, you know, go to church and they have, you know, Jesus is on the cross, right? And they go, yes, Jesus. And then the atheists go and they all get together and they go to this place and they have Jesus on the cross on a cross.
They've crucified
the
crucifixion.
No.
And then that's your horseshoe right there. That's your horseshoe.
You're right.